you're familiar with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. There's a little bit of a story behind that. In fact, let me see if I can find this book. Lewis wrote a book called Miracles. Let me see if I can find this over here. Here it is. So this is an actual true first edition of Miracles by C.S. Lewis. This is a British first edition, and this book was in some ways one of his initial kind of forays into being a public theologian, a public apologist, defender of the faith. This was, this came out in 47, and this book led to a debate, and the debate was between Lewis and there was a nun, a Professor Bascom, who was herself a very renowned philosopher, and in this book, Lewis had made the effort to show that materialism can account for thought. And to paraphrase Lewis's idea here is that if all my thoughts are just chemical actions and reactions happening in my brain, then I have no reason to trust the thought that all my thoughts are just chemical actions and reactions happening in my brain. In other words, materialism, a materialistic accounting of the universe, cannot account for the non-material. So if I think that my thoughts are just material chemicals arranging themselves, then I really can't trust the thought that my chemicals are arranging themselves and that is in itself thought. So if all my thoughts are just chemical actions and reactions happening in my brain, I have no reason to trust the thought that all my thoughts are just chemical actions and reactions happening in my brain. Well, this philosopher, nun, responded and said essentially, well, that argument falls apart. Material can account for conclusions, can account for thought, can account for reason. And she used the example of a scale, like a scale you would weigh something on. So you can stand on a scale and it will give you actual information. So if I stood on a scale right now, it would tell me that I weigh 200 pounds. Of course, I just had a McDonald's cheeseburger, and so that might be about 215 pounds. But she said that you can sit on a scale and you can weigh something. You can weigh some material. You can weigh a human body. You can weigh a sack of grain. You can weigh things, and that scale, which is all matter, it is all material. Every part of the scale is matter, and yet it will give you numbers. It will give you weight. It will measure for you. And at that moment, Lewis thought that he had been completely devastated in debate. In fact, he goes back and tells his friend Hugo Dyson, I have been obliterated in debate. He spiraled into a depression because he had never really been vested in an argument. If you remember from last semester, Lewis was very, very quick on his feet. He was rarely ever vested in an argument, virtually never lost debate, and yet this nun says, well, what about a scale? A scale is material, and it gives you accurate information. It gives you accurate, we might say, thought or reason or a conclusion when the number comes up. And Lewis conceded he had lost the debate and had to go back and try to revise his book Miracles. Now again, this is a first edition, a British first edition. His publisher Geoffrey Bless is going to come up here in just a little bit in our talk tonight. But of course, I wish Lewis could have back in the day heard of a man named Cornelius Antilli. It would have helped him out a lot in this situation. Because what do you think is the problem? If I say if all my thoughts are just chemical actions and reactions happening in my brain, then I have no reason to trust the thought that all my thoughts are just chemical actions and reactions happening in my brain. And when she responded, well, what do you do with the scale? It's all matter. It's just gears and other mechanisms that respond and give you an accurate reading of the weight of something. How would you respond to that? How is that actually not a devastating response? Yeah. The minds have to interpret the scale. So I look at the result of that scale. It brings, if I step on a scale right now, I'd say 200 pounds, but yet it's minds that have to interpret the number 2 and the number 0, the number 0. You know, what is a universal of 2-ness or 0-ness or 100-ness, if I can say it that way? And so what you essentially have on the backside of that is it's still minds interpreting data. And so Lewis's argument still holds. So that's on the backside that would defeat this particular philosopher's argument. On the front side of it, the scale itself, in order for it to produce an accurate piece of data or render an accurate measurement or weight, thought had to go into it in terms of the ratios of the pulleys and the gears and the various mechanisms within the scale, depending on what kind of scale it was, whether it's like a digital scale you might have in your bathroom or an old-fashioned scale that used weights and pulleys and counterweights and so forth. Thought had to go into that. In other words, that scale as it functions, whether it functions accurately or inaccurately. Let's say it's a scale that's off a few pounds, and I stepped on it, and instead of 200 pounds, it said I was 190 pounds, so it's off 10 pounds. Whatever that scale would render, the scale itself is the product of thought. It is a product of design. And so the scale itself only functions, whether it functions accurately or inaccurately. Let's say it's functioning accurately. That scale itself is only functioning not according to a purely materialistic principle, right? It's functioning according to laws of physics, laws that relate to deduction, etc. But Lewis, at that moment, felt himself soundly defeated, and it caused him to spiral because, again, as I said, he never really invested in debate, and he went, back to the Burden baby and met with Hugo Dyson with his face in his hands, and said, "I have been obliterated in a debate." Well, it was after this, and after he had written things like Miracles, and as we discovered last semester, things like The Problem of Pain, that he turned his attention to the Narnia series. Now, some will say, and there was one particular biography in particular who said that, well, because he got so trounced in that debate, which as we've shown rather easily here, a more presuppositional approach would have answered that nun's argument. And yet some will say because of that moment, he moved away from public apologetics and started writing fairy stories, started writing children's tales, because he realized at this moment that he really needed to turn from these kind of public apologetics. Well, number one, that's not actually the case. He continued to write other things, believe it or not, than the Narnia series. He had already been writing fiction. He had already written the space trilogy, as some people call it, or more accurately, the ransom trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet, Paralandra, and That Hideous Strength, which we'll look at in just a couple of weeks. But by the end of the 40s, with his theological writings, his apologetics, his literary criticism, he starts writing fairy tales. And it's in some ways, why did he do this? What was his rationale behind it? He never wrote like an essay, like a critical essay on why he started doing this. Instead, we find most of his rationale, most of his reason, his impetus for writing the Narnia series in Letters to Children, and then in 3 essays found in Of This and Other Worlds, which Ken probably has on the table over here. And so on 3 ways of writing for children, or what we're going to call 3 ways for short, sometimes fairy stories may say best what's to be said, or what we're going to call sometimes fairy stories. And then another essay, it all began with a picture. Now, in 3 ways, or 3 ways of writing for children, in 3 ways, he defended this approach according to the following criteria. Number 1, he said critics who treat adult, the word adult, as a term of approval instead of a merely descriptive term cannot be adult themselves. To be concerned about being grown up, to admire the grown up because it is grown up, to blush at the suspicion of being childish, these things are the marks of childhood and adolescence. When I was 10, I read fairy tales in secret and would have been ashamed if I had been found doing so. Now that I am 50, I read them openly. When I became a man, I put away childish things, including the fear of childishness and the desire to be very grown up. The second thing he said is that this modern view that kind of downplays children and emphasizes adulthood involves an untrue idea about what growth actually is, what maturity actually is. And so when people said, well, you're writing this, and this is a case of arrested development on your part, you're going back to your childish ways. He said, surely arrested development consists not in refusing to lose old things, but in failing to add new things. I now like Hawk, which I am sure I would not have liked as a child. You remember we talked about when the war was going on, there was an American admirer, a friend of his, a doctor, who would send hams over across the Atlantic, and it was a delicacy because of the rationing that was going on in England. So I now like Hawk, which I'm sure I should not have liked as a child, but I still like lemon squash. I call this growth or development because I have been enriched. Where I formerly had only one pleasure, I now have two. But if I had to lose the taste for lemon squash before I acquired the taste for Hawk, that would not be growth, but simple change. A tree grows, Lewis says, because it adds rings. A train doesn't grow by leaving one station behind and puffing on to the next. I think my growth is just as apparent when I now read the fairy tales as when I read the novelists. For now, I now enjoy the fairy tales better than I did in childhood, being now able to put more in. And so you'll find folks who, like me, say you discovered the Harry Potter series as an adult. And we think of that as something primarily for maybe young adult. We talk about YAF, young adult fiction. Or I just recently am reading through the Wingfeather saga. And if you've read through Wingfeather, you know that Andrew Peterson wrote that for children, and yet I am enthralled by it. And that's what Lewis is getting at here. Though the Narnia series is, yes, it is written for children, why is it that you would show up on a cold night like this to talk about Narnia? Why is it you would reread The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? And so I don't think Lewis has to convince you much here. But the third thing that he mentioned was that this idea of fairy tales only being associated with children, he would refer to his friend J.R.R. Tolkien's essay on fairy stories. Now, if you ever have the opportunity to read on fairy stories, it'll make sense of why you love to read Lewis, why you love to read Lord of the Rings, why you love to read certain kinds of science fiction or fantasy. And on fairy stories, there are a couple of things. Lewis's or Tolkien's piece Tree and Leaf, along with the poem Mythopoeia. Now, the poem Mythopoeia, I think I read some of that last semester when we talked about Lewis and Dyson and Tolkien taking their stroll around Addison's Walk at Magdalen College. And in this piece, Tree and Leaf on fairy stories, Tolkien says, in describing a fairy story, which they think adults might possibly read for their own entertainment, reviewers frequently indulge in such waggeries, that's such an English word, such waggeries, tongue wagging, such waggeries as, quote, this book is for children from the ages of 6 to 60. But I have never yet seen the puff of a new motor model that began thus. This toy will amuse infants from 17 to 70. The association of children and fairy stories is an accident of our domestic history. Fairy stories have, in the modern lettered world, been relegated to the nursery, as shabby or old-fashioned furniture is relegated to the playroom, primarily because the adults do not want it and do not mind if it is misused. Children, as a class, except in common lack of experience, they are not one, neither like fairy stories more nor understand them better than adults do. And then fourthly, Lewis sort of defends his approach here by saying that modern novels, like adult novels, actually give children less of a false impression of the world than fairy tales. In other words, no literature gives children less of a false impression of the world than fairy tales. In other words, you find truth in fairy tales. Not because you're describing something foreign to children when you talk about dragons and knights and valiant knights going into battle, but because that is the experience of the world they see around them. And he's going to say they need this. Now, if you think about his context, children were experiencing the bombing raids in London. They knew this world was full of dragons. This is not just kind of an empty fairy tale. They knew the world was full of devils and dragons. What they needed was the hope they could be defeated. And so he believed that realistic stories for children were more likely to deceive than the fairy tale. Realistic stories could contain adventures and all kinds of things, of course. But he said they also raise a false impression, he calls it. And he said something similar to this in Experiment on Criticism. In other words, He says that when we talk about things as if they are only realistic, we miss the opportunity to get in touch with what children know to be true, namely that there are dragons, there are things. He says later to the charge that if you write fairy tales because they have monsters and dragons in them, they're only going to scare children. He says there is something ludicrous in the idea of so educating a generation which is born to the Agapu and the atomic bomb, since it is so likely that they will meet cruel enemies. Let them at least have a herd of brave knights and heroic courage. I side impenitently with the human race against the modern reformer. Let there be wicked kings and beheadings, battles and dungeons, giants and dragons, and let villains be soundly killed at the end of the book. Nothing will persuade me that this causes an ordinary child any kind or degree of fear beyond what it wants and needs to feel. For of course, it wants to be a little frightened. And what Lewis was saying there, and if you read the Chronicles of Narnia, these are children's stories. They're going to be like a Beatrix Potter book, and there's not going to be heads being lopped off, but you know that's not the case. You've read the Chronicles of Narnia, you know that there are battles being waged, and the enemy is crushed, and villains are killed. There are heroes who are coming to save the day. There are knights, there are dragons. There's danger of all kinds, but he's saying this doesn't cause children fear. Children are already afraid. They live in a fearful world. They live in a world of very fearsome things. And so let's give them the courage that these things can be defeated and that good will ultimately triumph. And the way that Lewis does this is not that good is some sort of platonic ideal, but good in the person of Christ the Redeemer. Now, Lewis says that was in three things there, or the three ways. He says then in sometimes fairy stories, listen to this, when he talks about, again, the inspiration for Narnia. And sometimes fairy stories, he distinguishes between the author as a writer, the author is author, and the author is a man or a citizen. And he says the author has a reason for saying certain things. And he says as an author himself, he fell in love with the form of fairy tales because of its brevity. It's what he calls severe restraints on description, and its flexible traditionalism. Its inflexible hostility to all analysis, digression, reflections, and gas, he says. In other words, when you're telling a fairy story, you describe things, you paint pictures. Whereas in books that are more pedantic, you're worried about logical analysis, you're worried about statistics and that kind of thing. So there's a brevity imposed on the form. And he says, I fall in love with that form because of the fact that it communicates. He said, listen, I thought I saw how stories of this kind could steal past a certain inhibition which had paralyzed much of my own religion in childhood. You remember we talked about the fact that he was raised as a Christian as he became a late teen. He turned away from Christianity, and throughout his 20s, he was an atheist to the bone. And yet, as he would later say, the Holy Spirit laid hold of him, caught him in his net. I thought of how stories of this kind could still past a certain inhibition, which had paralyzed much of my own religion in childhood. Why did one find it so hard to feel as one was told one ought to feel about God or about the sufferings of Christ? I thought the chief reason was that one was told one ought to. An obligation to feel can freeze feelings. He says of Lucy at one point when Lucy's trying to go to sleep. This is in Prince Caspian. She's trying to go to sleep, and she can't. And he says, the hardest thing in going to sleep is trying to go to sleep. And so she's trying hard to go to sleep, but that's what makes it all the harder. And so similarly here, the one thing that can freeze feelings is the obligation to feel. And reverence itself did harm. The whole subject was associated with the lowered voices, almost as if it were something medical. But supposing, and I think even there, he talks about the lowered muffled voices while his mom was dying, and those low muffled voices that just portended foreboding and doom as he was listening from his bedroom. And so that's what he's getting at there, kind of in the back of his mind. But supposing that by casting all these things into an imaginary world, stripping them of their stained glass and Sunday school associations, one could make them for the first time appear in their real potency. Could one not thus steal past those watchful dragons? I thought one could. So, jump into Narnia, and you see, of course, Aslan. And people will say, well, is this the Christ figure? And of course, Lewis admitted that Aslan is the Christ figure, but he refused to have Narnia described as a simple allegory. He called it a supposing or a supposal. Suppose there was a world like ours in which the Son of God came, and suppose he came in the form of a lion, the son of the emperor across the sea. And so think of Narnia not as an allegory, not strictly as a fairy tale, but as a supposal, as a supposing. Now, this idea, of course, takes root in England and in America, and Narnia starts flying off the shelves. In fact, you'll see here, this is a first British edition of Narnia. I'll say more about that here in a bit, but these are here American first editions, and there are a few differences in wording here and there between the British and American editions, but Narnia starts selling on both sides of the Atlantic, and even to this day, believe it or not, children still write letters to C.S. Lewis. They go to the trust thanking him for his books. And of course, when the books were coming out, he was flooded. I have 3 thick, massive volumes back there of the letters of Lewis, many of them to children. He never failed to respond to children when they would ask questions about Aslan, or ask questions about Lucy, or ask questions about Narnia, or even, as we're going to see, ask questions about what the proper reading order of Narnia is. I have a very definite opinion about that. You may differ. But the children start writing into him, and so we learn a lot about his impetus for writing Narnia in these responses to children, in the ways that he would tell them about why he wrote, what he was thinking as he wrote these things. And so you see this again in letters to children. You see it in 3 ways. You see it, and it all began in a picture, which was something he actually wrote for children. And he says it all began with a picture. You must not believe all authors that tell you about how they wrote their books, not because they mean to lie, but because a man writing a story is too excited about the story itself to sit back and notice how he is doing it. In fact, that might stop the works, just as if you start thinking about how you tie your tie, the next thing is that you find you can't tie it. And afterwards, when the story is finished, he's forgotten a good deal of what writing it was like. Think about the fact that you came over here tonight and you put on your shoes and you tied your shoes. Did you go through methodically in a very rational step-by-step fashion? This is how I tie my shoe. You may have done that when you were learning how to tie your shoe as a child, but no, you just tied your shoe and went on your way. And he's saying, for me, I wasn't giving that much thought to how I was writing. I was just letting it happen. And yet he told the children a lot about why he was doing what he was doing. In fact, in sometimes fairy stories, he says, some people seem to think that I began by asking myself how I could say something about Christianity to children, then fixed on the fairy tale as an instrument, then collected information about child psychology and decided what age group I'd write for, then drew up a list of basic Christian truths and hammered out allegories to embody them. This is all pure moonshine. Have any of you ever tasted moonshine before? Any of you in here? Yeah, because I'm from Lebanon, Tennessee, so it probably doesn't surprise you. I have tasted moonshine before, and I'm going to be honest with you. I love a good bourbon, but I cannot for the life of me understand why anybody would enjoy moonshine other than for its effect. But this is all pure moonshine. I couldn't write in that way. It all began with images, a fawn carrying an umbrella, a queen on a sledge, a magnificent line. At first, there wasn't even anything Christian about them. That element pushed itself in of its own accord. And this is consistent with Lewis because you may recall last semester, I think I mentioned this, that Billy Graham came over to England to do a series of evangelistic meetings, and he met with Lewis. And eventually, Decision Magazine, which was the magazine back in the 50s of the Billy Graham Association, And one of the editors, one of the writers for Decision magazine, met with Lewis and started pressing in upon him and telling him, when did you make your decision for Christ? When did you decide for Christ? And Lewis said, I don't know that I decided for Christ. He just kind of came and got me. And the writer kept pressing in. But it was a decision. When was your decision? And of course, that was the whole thrust of the Billy Graham crusade. And we're thankful for Billy Graham. But Lewis kept pushing back and say, yes, I decided to believe in Jesus, but it was not so much a decision I made as much as he just came and laid hold of me. Now, if you read A Severe Mercy, he's talking in Severe Mercy, writing letters to an atheist who's struggling with Christianity. And eventually, this person begins to concede that maybe Christianity is true. And Lewis writes back to him and says, you won't last long. The Holy Spirit already has you in his net. And so while Lewis was not a Calvinist in the strict sense of the term, as I've said before, the fact that he was as evangelical as he was in that exceedingly theologically and philosophically liberal context of England of the 20th century is nothing short of a miracle in itself. And yet there are ways in which he could rightly be called proto-reformed. We're going to see that when we look at Jill's interaction with Aslan the lion in the silver chair. But that's what he's saying here. I didn't try to say, I want to teach children about Christianity, so I'm going to take fairy tales as my medium, and I'm going to list out some doctrines, and I'm going to kind of wedge those doctrines into a fairy tale form. He said Christianity just pushed itself upon the books on its own. Now, of course, that's because he's a Christian, and he's writing from his worldview. He kind of furthers this, and it all began with a picture. And he enlarges on this idea of the images, image of a fawn, the image of a queen on a sledge, etc. All my 7 Narnian books and my 3 science fiction books began with seeing pictures in my head. At first, they were not a story, just pictures. The Lion all began with a picture of a fawn carrying an umbrella and parcels in a snowy wood. This picture had been in my mind since I was about 16. Then one day, when I was about 40, I said to myself, let's try to make a story about it. At first, I had very little idea how the story would go. But then suddenly, Aslan came bounding into it. I think I had been having a good many dreams of lions about that time. Apart from that, I don't know where the lion came from or why he came. But once he was there, he pulled the whole story together. And soon he pulled the other 6 Narnian stories in after him. Now, we're going to talk about the publication order of the Chronicles of Narnia, as well as the chronological order in terms of the way the story plays out, and the debate that exists between which is the best order to read them in, and even what Lewis himself said about it, which is probably not going to surprise you when we get to it. But back in 3 ways of writing to children, he talks about this image piece again, this idea of pictures. He says some of these pictures have a common flavor, almost a common smell, which groups them together. Keep quiet and watch, and they will begin joining themselves up. If you were very lucky, I've never been as lucky as all that, a whole set might join themselves so consistently that there you had a complete story without doing anything yourself. But more often, in my experience always, there are gaps. Then at last, you have to do some deliberate inventing, have to contrive reasons why these characters should be in these various places, doing these various things. Now, you're going to see that, for instance, if you begin with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and then you read as you should, and if you disagree, you should go pray about it. If you continue as you should with Prince Caspian, you realize that the children in the story, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, appear again in Prince Caspian. And then you're going to find out that Lewis starts playing with time. You go to the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and things start going backward. Or in Prince Caspian, things go backwards. And then you go forward in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And so Lewis is not so concerned about writing chronologically this linear thing. He's trying to tell stories. He's trying to get across truths about Christ. Again, Christ just forced himself on Lewis as a person, forced himself into the stories themselves. Now, you will recall last semester that when Britain declared war on Germany, the 3rd of September, 1939, children had to be evacuated from London because there were going to be bombing raids, going to be very, very dangerous. And you'll remember we talked last semester about the fact that a large group of children were sent out to Oxford and took up residence for quite some time at the Kilns. Most of them were young girls that were being kept there, and Jack and Warnie and Minto, remember Mrs. Moore, took care of these schoolgirls. And Lewis loved this. He loved having the children around, and he loved interacting with them and the fact that they were being protected there tonight. But he noticed they were really interested in the war and in battles and in these bombings and so forth that were being reported on the radio. And so he wrote that these books were written in part with a view of these children in mind. In other words, had the children not come and stayed at his house, he likely would not have turned his mind to the importance of writing for children. And so the residency of these children at the Kilns led to him doing this. Now, you'll notice that some of the names of the children in the books, some of the characters that are in the Chronicles of Narnia, are the names of some of the children that were staying there in the house. He said he has a manuscript form of the Dark Tower, which Ken probably has the Dark Tower over here as well. He wrote on the manuscript of the Dark Tower, on the back page of the manuscript of the Dark Tower, which was written in 39, by the way. This book is about 4 children whose names were Anne, Martin, Rose, and Peter. But it is mostly about Peter, who was the youngest. They all had to go away from London suddenly because of the air raids, and because father, who was in the army, had gone off to the war, and mother was doing some kind of war work. They were sent to stay with a relation of mother's who was a very old professor who lived by himself in the country. So if you look at the textual history, and we'll do more of this next week once we get through some of the storyline and Michael Ward's thesis about Narnia, we'll look a little bit more in detail at the chronology or the history of Narnia, and we'll maybe make some comments about the textual process of Narnia. For instance, you can look at some of his notebooks and so forth, and you can see him scratching out ideas or word pictures or putting ideas down. Jonathan Edwards was very, very similar. This past summer, I got to go to the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale in New Haven, and visit the site there and hold in my own hot mitts some of the manuscripts of Jonathan Edwards' writings. And some of these are what were called miscellanies. Now, the miscellanies were when Jonathan, his dates were 1703 to 58. So the miscellanies, and he had a couple thousand of them, was when he would have a thought come into his head about some philosophical, excuse me, or I don't know what's in the air. I think the warm-up is starting to, but I welcome it. Whatever it brings, I'll sneeze. When a philosophical or theological or biblical or a preaching thought came into his mind, he would write that thought down on whatever scrap of paper was available to him. And paper was very, very much in short supply in Edward's day. His wife and several daughters made paper fans as kind of a side hustle. And any scraps of paper that were left from those paper fans, he would gather those up. And so when you look at his manuscripts, there are these booklets sewn together, and every page is a different shape, and one's a half page, and it's cut in the form of a moon or some such thing, but he was a miser with paper. Well, he would write these notes down often while he was out horseback riding, and he would pin them to his jacket and come back looking like he had been through a snowstorm, and then he would transfer these notes into his various notebooks of miscellaneous thoughts. And then he would take those miscellaneous thoughts and incorporate them into treatises or theological works or sermons, etc. Well, in some ways, Lewis would do some of this in his notebooks, much the way that you might journal ideas down before you write a full essay. And so you can see how he was working out in kind of embryonic fashion some of the characters and some of the places and some of the creatures and themes and so forth that you see when you read Narnia. But you remember we talked last semester about a man named Chad Walsh. Chad Walsh, in many ways, sort of broke Lewis at a popular level to the American public. Honestly, Screwtape did that and Narnia. But in terms of a writing about Lewis, kind of a secondary source about Lewis, The first major one in the States was C.S. Lewis's Epistle to the Skeptics. And he said that while he had been over visiting Lewis to kind of get some information for the writing of the book, that Lewis talked, quote, vaguely of completing a children's book, which he has begun in the tradition of E. Nesbitt. And we mentioned some of that last semester. Another man, Roger Lancelin Green, actually would read all of Lewis's Narnia books when they are in manuscript form, make comments on them, make suggestions and so forth. Of course, this same thing would happen with The Bird and Baby, when the Inklings would get together and they would share their writing, share their manuscripts of things they were working on. Lewis passed out all of the proofs of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and they read those aloud and talked about them and so forth. But as you've probably heard, while Lewis was quite supportive and encouraging of Tolkien in the writing of The Lord of the Rings, in fact, Tolkien admits, had it not been for Jack, they never would have been written. Tolkien was very slow and methodical and a perfectionist and never could get on with it because it was never good enough for his liking. And Lewis was constantly encouraging him and prodding him on. One of my professors at Westminster back in the day said there are two types of PhD dissertations, perfect ones and completed ones. And I think he said that to me because I was striving for a perfect one, and there's nothing quite as imperfect as incomplete. And I was in danger of not completing it. So he said there are two types of dissertations, perfect and or perfect and completed ones. And so Tolkien barely got it completed. He was striving for perfection. And so when he heard Lewis's manuscripts being read from Chronicles of Narnia, he said to Lancelin Green, I hear you've been reading Jack's children's story. It really won't do. It really won't do, you know. I mean to say nymphs and their ways, the love life of a faun. Doesn't he know what he's talking about? In other words, for Tolkien, the Chronicles of Narnia seemed rather higgledy-piggledy. They were just all over the place. He couldn't figure out how they worked together. And one would come out, and then another one would come out, but it didn't seem like it was linear in some chronological fashion. You had things like in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Santa Claus showing up. What in the world is Santa Claus doing in Narnia? It just seemed so haphazard. It seemed like maybe instead of putting a box of Legos together according to the instruction manual, you just dumped a bunch out on a table and sort of free-formed it. And so he thought that the Chronicles of Narnia were a mess. Thematically, they were a mess in terms of character development and the way that Lewis would put these inexplicable characters from different universes into Narnia. And he didn't think too much of it. He thought Lewis was better than this. And certainly, this would never fly for Middle-earth, would it? Because Middle-earth, you'll read 3 or 4 pages talking about how green a blade of grass is. And if you've ever been there, if you've ever been reading Tolkien, and there are times that you're reading him and you're like, I love reading Tolkien, but I must consign myself now that the beauty of this is that at the end of 3 pages, I will know all of the various hues and colors and shades of the way dew appears on a branch. That was Tolkien. It was very meticulous. It was exceedingly detailed. Well, that's not what Lewis was going for, and so for Tolkien, didn't think much of it. Now, that's been overblown over time. People have made too much of that and said that was the beginning of their friendship kind of going on ice for a while. That really wasn't it at all. These men were very thick-skinned. They had it out in the Inklings. They had it out. They weren't sensitive. They weren't, overly concerned about one another's feelings, and they shot straight with each other. What, as we discovered last semester, led really to the icing of their relationship had more to do with the fact that Tolkien married, as you remember, Joy Davidman, along with the fact that Tolkien never could quite get over that even though Lewis became a Christian, he did not become Roman Catholic. Now, again, as we discovered, they remained friends throughout their lives. And Tolkien, came to see him at the end of his life. So more has been made of it that probably should. Also because Tolkien kept copies of the Chronicles for his grandchildren. And so he kept Chronicles of Narnia so he could give them away to his grandchildren. Certainly if he didn't like them or approve of them, he wouldn't have given them to his grandchildren. I think it was more from the standpoint of this is the man who can who can write the likes of The Problem of Pain or An Experiment in Criticism, and he's writing this kind of thing. Or this is the kind of man who can write something like the Ransom series. You remember, Tolkien had quite a hand in the Ransom series first being published. And in fact, Ransom himself was figured after Tolkien. And so Lewis sort of honors J.R.R. Tolkien by making the main character in the Ransom series, Elwin Ransom, a linguist, a philologist. He is patterned after Tolkien. And so the main hero of the Ransom series ultimately is Tolkien. And yet he felt the Chronicles of Narnia were just too, as Michael Ward says, slapdash, which is a great English phrase. Just slapdash. It's kind of slung together and there's no rhyme or reason to it. I can't follow it. And so Lewis admitted, though, sometimes these pictures that are coming, they don't immediately group themselves into a set. You got to see what I'm going at. I'm trying to see what I'm doing here. And he embedded Easter eggs in each one of the 7 Chronicles of Narnia. How many of you went and listened to any of the lectures by Michael Ward over the break? So three of you. We're going to play a clip here in just a little bit from Michael Ward that will kind of get all of us up to speed. And then we'll talk more specifically next week about his thesis and how that applies to the 7 of the books. But there's an Easter egg embedded in every single one. Yeah, it is mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing. And now once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. So be warned, you're about to, why should I warn you? You're going to listen to it. You're going to see it tonight. But I'll just let you know, once you hear what Michael Ward says, and particularly next week after we go into it with a little more depth and detail, you'll never be able to unsee it. And you'll see what Lewis saw as he was writing, which is something Tolkien never was able to detect, as brilliant as he was. And it probably is one of the things that caused Tolkien to say, there's no connection. He doesn't know what he's doing here. Lewis knew what he was doing, and he took it to his grave. Well, you see various, rough sketches and in the textual history, and we'll look at some of that next week. But I want to say a little bit here about the publication of the books and so forth, and why that matters. Between the summer of 1948 and March of 51. He had already written 5 of the Chronicles of Narnia. Back in November of 1950, he had written several chapters of what was first going to be called Night Under Narnia. And then it was then going to be called The Wild Wastelands. We know it, of course, as this, The Silver Chair. As we're going to say, Lewis was really not that great with titles. He had a lot of anxiety over titles. There were several titles out. And so a lot of the titles that we have, that we know of the Chronicles of Narnia, are things that he would suggest a list of titles, and the publisher would say, I like this one best. And so The Silver Chair, for instance, was originally going to be called Night Under Narnia. In fact, that was the working title. And then The Wild Wastelands, because The Wild Wastelands appears in The Silver Chair, but eventually he decided he would call it Silver Chair. He had earlier, of course, written The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But by 51, he had written 5 of the Chronicles of Narnia. And you can look back in his notebooks and see a lot of the details laid out in no particular fashion. And you can see how he took those things and would put this idea or this creature or this particular location in this book. And this particular theme would be dominant in this book. And so in some ways, he didn't just let it all come to him in sort of this stream of consciousness fashion. He was putting ideas out, much the way Edwards did with his miscellanies, but then he would take them and put them into the larger or finished works. Now, one of the things that we need to talk about here, of course, is the publication date. Now, the publication dates, I'll get into in a second, but if you go by a set of the Chronicles of Narnia now, this is what it's going to look like. Book 1, The Magician's Nephew. Book 2, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Book 3, The Horse and His Boy. Book 4, Prince Caspian. Book 5, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Book 6, The Silver Chair. And Book 7, The Last Battle. And it would be quite understandable. In fact, Ken has a set over there, and I'm sure that's the numbering of them. That is called the chronological order. Or if you start at day one of Narnia, when everything began, you would actually begin with a story of the magician's nephew and the creation of Narnia. However, while you can read it that way, and I would imagine a lot of people do read it that way because they buy the set and they say, well, why should I start with book 4? I should start with book 1. And they do that. But I think something is lost. And most kind of stuffy, snooty Lewisians agree with me on this, that you really need to begin at the true beginning, which is not the chronological beginning, but it's really the beginning of the story. It was the first thing he wrote, which is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Now, the dates of these books, and Lewis would later tell a child who wrote to him and said, well, which order should I read these things in? And Lewis, being Lewis, said, well, read them in whatever order you want to. It really doesn't matter. You're going to see what is there to be seen. And so just pick which way you want to go and read them as you feel like you want to. And so officially, Lewis wasn't that hung up on which order you read them in. And yet I think it's probably best to read them in the order in which they were first published, or in other words, the order in which they were written and released over a period of years, despite the numbering that you'll see on the spine of a particular volume of the set. And again, the reason for that is that there's something kind of serendipitous once you know the story of the Pevensey children and you know the story of Aslan, then to go on from there and to read Prince Caspian, and from there Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and from there Silverchair. And that's probably the most important segment to get in order, right? Is to read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, then skip over to Prince Caspian, then The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, then Silverchair, then go back to Volume 1 if you would like and read about the creation of Narnia. Of course, you can end with The Last Battle, but that's because that's the order in which they came to him. That's the order in which they appeared in his own thinking as he hammered these things out. And so the publication order, if you're a note taker here, is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, 1950, Prince Caspian, 51, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, 52, The Silverchair, 53, The Horse and His Boy, 54, The Magician's Nephew, 55, and then The Last Battle in 56. And again, I think if you will particularly read it in that order is the order I would suggest. Again, I'll say it again. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Silverchair, Horse and His Boy, Nephew, and Battle. If you'll read it in that order, you'll get you'll get the drama as it was unfolding in Lewis's own thinking, after he had put certain characters in place and certain themes in place. And it's, for me, and maybe some of you here, maybe Debbie, this would just completely, throw you into a fit, but there's something I enjoy about the chaos of reading it in that order. And there is a certain chaos to it because there's certain things that just don't make sense, and you have to kind of be held in suspense. And then later on, you go back and read a book that technically, chronologically, in the history of Narnia occurred before, and it's that moment of serendipity, that moment of discovering, oh, that's what he was talking about. I remember when I read this in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and now that I'm going back all these books later and reading The Magician's Nephew, it just seems to have more of a dramatic appeal to me, and I think to most Lewis lovers. Anyway, now I want to say a little bit here about the illustrations. You'll remember, yeah.
Before, can we throw out one particular thing, and that's in what you're saying, the very first mention of Aslan, right? The first time you encounter Aslan in Narnia changes depending on which book you read first.
Oh, do tell. Okay, good.
The passage in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where Aslan is first mentioned, the 4 children hear his name, and Lewis says something like, now none of these children knew who Aslan was any more than you do.
Mm-hmm.
But, and then he goes on to describe the inexplicable feelings that come over each of them, and it's different for each of them. Now,
yeah, he said there was a jump. They jumped when they heard the name Aslan.
If you read that, having already read any of the other books, that passage makes no sense. You know who Aslan is, and you're not really discovering Aslan alongside the children. Your journey is different from theirs, where your journey really is meant to be alongside the 4 children. That's
exactly right. I could not have said it better myself. You're discovering things as, frankly, Lewis is discovering them. because he's writing them out in this chronological order. And if you begin, as most people probably do when they buy the set, you begin with volume 1, yeah, you realize who Aslan is. Here, spoiler alert, he is the creator. And you come to book 2, and Lewis says, you don't know who Aslan is. You're discovering him for the first time just as the children are. Well, some of that serendipity that the children are experiencing when they first hear the name Aslan is lost on you. It's lost on you. And so I think reading it in publication order, you're going to be better able to feel what the characters are feeling along the way. That's very, very well said. I think it's especially important, though, to read, well, again, as I say, read them in publication order, but at the very least, just promise me that you will read Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, followed by Caspian, followed by Voyage, followed by Silverchair. I think those in a quartet really then do what you feel like you got to do if you want to rebel and knock yourself out. But those 4 together seem to just give you the feels that you need. And by that time, you're going to be hooked anyway. And some of you already are. You wouldn't be here. You wouldn't be here tonight. One more thing, though. The titling of the books, I said, for instance, Silverchair was going to be called The Wild Wastelands. Lewis had written The Horse and His Boy and sent a list of titles to his publisher, Jeffrey Bless. And this is an example of how Jeffrey Bless, the editor there, had a hand in selecting the titles that Lewis would send. And so on the 13th of April, 1953, he said, what are your thoughts about the following possibilities for this book here, The Horse and His Boy? And so he gave his publisher the following options. He said, what about The Horse and the Boy? Because that would, he said, appeal to the fact that books about ponies were really popular at the time. And so it would help sales. That's The Horse and the Boy. Or The Desert Road to Narnia. Or The Horse Stole the Boy. Over the Border, The Horse Brie. And Bless replied, I like best The Horse and the Boy. But what about The Horse and His Boy? Which is a little startling and conveys the idea of your other title, The Horse Stole His Boy. And so it's still about the boy, and it's still about the horse, and it conveys this idea that it's his now. How did he get it? The Horse and His Boy. And so that's how we have the title there. But Pauline Baines, you'll remember I mentioned Pauline Baines last semester, and she is the illustrator, of course. If you read the Chronicles of Narnia, you see those delightful sketches and illustrations that run throughout the Chronicles of Narnia. She came Lewis's way at the suggestion of J.R.R. Tolkien. In some of his writings, she had done some of the illustration. Now, a lot of the illustrations in Tolkien's work are his own. I have books back there, whole entire books on the art of J.R.R. Tolkien, which is just all of his sketches and his final sketches in progress, and so forth. What you see, for instance, in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, that's mainly Tolkien's own handiwork, and yet in his work, Farmer Giles of Ham, this young lady, Pauline Baines, had done the illustrations for him, and he recommended her to Lewis, and Lewis met with her. You might recall back last semester that there was a poet who kind of had a shine for Lewis, Ruth Pitzinger, and he had invited her to a dinner or a luncheon at the hotel there in Oxford, and she showed up, and much to her chagrin, she was there, and so was Pauline Baines. Lewis wasn't thinking anything of it. He was really pretty clueless to women and their attraction to him at times, and he wasn't thinking anything of it. Of course, Ruth Pitzinger was quite upset by this, but Pauline Baines was there. And Pauline Baines was this young lady, about 21 years old at the time, 21, 22. She had illustrated for Tolkien and was interviewing with Lewis to do some work for these new children's books that were coming out. And in August of 1967, she, reflecting back on her work for Lewis, Said Dr. Lewis and I hardly corresponded at all over the illustrations to his books. He was to me the most kindly and tolerant of authors. Probably wouldn't have been able to say that of Tolkien entirely, but who seemed happy to leave everything in my completely inexperienced hands. Once or twice I queried the sort of character he had in mind, as with Puddleglum. And then he replied, but otherwise he made no remarks or criticisms, despite the fact that the drawings were very far from perfect, or even possibly from what he had in mind. I had rather the feeling that, having got the story written down and out of his mind, the rest was someone else's job, and that he wouldn't interfere. As I remember, he only once asked for an alteration, and then with many apologies, when I, with my little knowledge, had drawn one of the characters rowing a boat facing the wrong direction. This is in Prince Caspian. When he did criticize, it was put ever so charmingly that it wasn't a criticism, i.e., I did the drawings as best I could. I can't have been much more than 21 and quite untrained, and didn't realize how hideous I'd made the children. They were as nice as I could get them. And Dr. Lewis said when we were starting on the second book, I know you made the children rather plain in the interest of realism, but do you think you could possibly pretty them up a little now? Was that not charmingly put, she says. She goes on to say that her time with Lewis and working with him, he was always the encourager, always very gentle and encouraging with her work. And she said, I lunched with Bless yesterday, Jeffrey Bless, to see the drawings for the horse, and I feel I must write. This is him writing to her. He met with the publisher, and I've just got a right to tell you, Pauline, how very much we both enjoy them. It is delightful to find, and not only for selfish reasons, that you do each book a little bit better than the last. It is nice to see an artist growing. If only you could take 6 months off and devote them to anatomy. There's no limit to your possibilities. Both the drawings of Lazarellian and her litter were a rich feast of line and a fantastic satiric imagination. My only regret was that we couldn't have both. Shasta among the tombs and the new technique, which is lovely, was exactly what I wanted. The pictures of Rabidash hanging on the hook and just turning into an ass were the best comedy you've done yet. The Tissock was superb, far beyond anything you were doing 5 years ago. I thought that your human faces, the boys, King, Loon, etc., were this time really good. The crowds are beautiful, realistic, yet also lovely, wavy compositions, but your crowds always were. How did you do Teshban? We only got its full wealth by using a magnifying glass. The result is exactly right. Thanks enormously for all the intense work you have put into them all, and more power to your elbow. Congratulations. When The Last Battle won the Carnegie Medal for Best Children's Book of 1956, Pauline Baines wrote at once to congratulate Lewis. He refused to take all the credit and replied a year later, is it not rather our medal? I'm sure the illustrations were taken into consideration as well as the texts. Well, very briefly, we'll talk here tonight about the Chronicles of Narnia, specifically The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And so I'm going to give just a brief summary, and then I'm going to show you a video, and then we're just going to kind of open up and talk about your own reading. I want to reward your reading of the Chronicles of Narnia by having you be able to kind of share your thoughts. It's going to be a little less of me this semester. Well, a prophecy. A little less of me this semester. The battery just went out. A little less of me this semester and a little more of y'all as we discuss the books that we read. Not just Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe, but Screwtape, Mere Christianity, etc. But let me just give you a brief overview here of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. There won't be any spoilers because you've read it already. How many of you have read Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe? Most everyone in the room. And you probably, even if you haven't, you feel like, I better go ahead and raise my hand because I don't want to be the only person here who said they haven't read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. You know the story of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, how it all begins with that precocious little girl, Lucy, who in many ways remains the darling of all the stories that the Pevensey children are in. Susan, as you'll discover, is a little more... She's a little less childlike in wonder, isn't she? But Lucy remains childlike and easily astonished and very tender-hearted. She's a very tender spirit, Lucy, and so she's very easy to love. But the four Pevensey children, Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy, are sent away from London during the war because the air raids. Of course, this is a very this is lived body detail for Lewis. This is a real experience. They go to the large house of old Professor Kirk. You remember Professor Kirkpatrick. You remember his professor who taught him Greek, who was so hard on him and was, intractable as a professor. He goes to old Professor Kirk's house, who lives in the country. Well, of course, Lucy finds a wardrobe. They're playing hide and seek, and she gets into this wardrobe in the spare room. She feels pine needles sticking her, which comes up again in Prince Caspian. If you've read Prince Caspian, she feels pine needles poking her, and there she meets perhaps my favorite character in Narnia, at least one of them, Mr. Tumnus, the faun. And the faun is kind of a conflicted character, and yet there's something very, very precious and tenderhearted about the faun as well, about Mr. Tumnus. She learns that Narnia, of course, is ruled by the White Witch, Jadis, and they've chased Mr. Tumnus into a thicket past the lamppost. Now, but this lamppost here, which was her drawing, and this is the original lamppost here that Lewis first saw. We've had it shipped over. This is actually the lamppost. This is actually the lamppost. You can see it in Oxford if you go there. This is the actual lamppost that Lewis had in mind and saw and incorporated into the story. But as you know, she goes back in, gets the kids. They come back into Narnia, and then the real adventure begins as they learn that this witch has made everything winter and yet never Christmas. When they come back, they find that her secret police have come in and destroyed Mr. Tumnus's home, and there is a letter charging him with high treason by Mogram, captain of the secret police. They are then befriended by a curious couple, Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, who are pretty significant for the rest of the story. And that's the first time, Jonathan, of course, they hear the name Aslan. And he says, at the name of Aslan, each one of the children felt something jump in its inside. What is that a reference to? They felt something jump in their inside.
Quickening.
A quickening?
Elizabeth.
Yeah, Elizabeth in the presence of Mary with baby Jesus in her womb. Yeah, have you ever thought about that? So he is embedding biblical imagery throughout, sometimes so subtly that if you don't know the Bible really well, you're going to miss it. Sometimes in other words, he's not trying to be kind of obnoxiously conspicuous, okay, with these biblical images. In other words, he doesn't come out and say at one point, and parentheses, Aslan is the Christ figure, kind of like the way the Apostle John does when he's writing in John chapter 2, but Jesus was speaking about the temple of his body. He was talking about the resurrection of his body there. Lewis doesn't do that for you. And so they hear the name Aslan and they feel something jump on the inside. Of course, as the Beavers explain, Aslan is the great lion, the, quote, king of the wood and the son of the great emperor beyond the sea. He's the son of the Father. And so Aslan has sent word that he wants to meet them at the stone table, because on this stone table there is an ancient prophecy that the White Witch will be overthrown as long as they can find 4 sons of Adam and daughters of Eve, and that these daughters of Eve and sons of Adam will sit on the throne at the great castle Caravel. Well, Edmund is hearing this, and what does Edmund do? He slips out. Edmund, thus far, is going to be, if you're looking for who's the antagonist, once Edmund kind of shapes up, of course, who is the next kind of antagonist that we meet in Prince Caspian? Eustace Scrubb. Because the way it begins, Eustace Scrubb, his parents named him Eustace Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. So Eustace Scrubb kind of takes the place of Edmund as this very, very troublesome and annoying little boy. But Edmund slips away to the White Witch, and there he learns what she really is all about, but it's too late. She's going to go back with Edmund. She's going to destroy the children, or prevent the children from getting to Aslan. She is very worried about Aslan, but as they're on the way, what starts happening? Well, what we're seeing around us. So there's a little bit of sun today, and what do we see? The ice starts melting away. There's a thaw out that begins to happen. And of course, this is happening. So she's got to get there and stop all of this from happening. The children join forces, of course, with all the Narnians who are loyal to Aslan, and they fight the army of the White Witch. And of course, Peter, Remember, this is ultimately about Peter. Peter fights and kills the wolf Mogrim and is knighted Sir Peter Wolfsbane. The witch, of course, is going to kill Edmund because she's furious that he has become a traitor. And, of course, a traitor has to die. And as you know, Aslan steps in and says, what about the deep magic, White Witch? What about the deep magic? The deep magic, of course, that he is pointing to and is causing her to have to admit that she knows what it is. Tell you what is written on that very table on the stone which stands beside us. Tell you what is written in letters deep as a spear as long on the fire stones of the secret hill. You know that every traitor belongs to me as my lawful prey, and that for every treachery I have a right to kill. But of course, Aslan steps in and offers his life in Edmund's place, and that is a deal too good for her to pass up. If she can be rid of Aslan, she can deal with Edmund later. And we'll read here in a bit. One of my favorite scenes is, the death of Aslan and how she cuts off his mane, which is an image the way they plucked out Jesus' beard, which was a way in Jewish culture of shaming a man, was to pluck out his beard, to truly humiliate him, you tear out his beard. She cuts off his mane, and I love the imagery of the mice coming along and chewing at the cords that held him down, which lead to his resurrection. And as you know, then as we get to Voyage of the Dawn Treader, you're going, and Prince Caspian and Dawn Treader, you're going to meet Reepicheep, the valiant mouse, and the way Aslan honors the mice because of their service to him and tearing away or chewing through his cords that kept him down. So he offers his life, but of course he rises, and we'll read some of it because it's some of the most beautiful passages in the Chronicles of Narnia, as Susan and Lucy are just trying to take in the reality that he has come back and he's larger than he ever was before. And actually he gets larger, as the story goes on, as the books go on, he gets larger and stronger. And it's not because he's getting larger and stronger, but he says to Lucy, I am larger because you are older. You see more of me now. You realize more of who I am. And that's why I look bigger to you now. You understand more of my purpose, more of who I am. Of course, they come in, they destroy the White Witch, and Narnia is restored, and all of the Narnians who had been cursed by her and turned into stone are brought back to life. One of them, of course, being Mr. Tumnus. And this is one of the things I think was really well done in the movie all those years ago, like 25 years ago. I think we're on the 20th or 25th anniversary of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And I love the scene where Mr. Tumnus is there, concretized in stone, with his hands up and fear in his face. And of course, they come back to life. Lewis, this is something that Lewis takes over, a thing that he takes over in his prose as well, when he says, that he's talking about the resurrection, he says, the world is the great sculptor shop, and we are the sculptors. And there's a rumor going about that some of us someday are going to come back to life. And this is his way of talking about the resurrection. You'll hear preachers say sometimes the resurrection changes everything. It really comes from Lewis. Lewis is saying once the resurrection has happened, this really is the center point of human history, and nothing remains the same because of it. But of course, this story sets us up to do some discussion. But what I love is what he says here. This is the deeper magic from before the dawn of time. If a willing victim who had committed no treachery is killed in a traitor's place, the table shall crack, and death itself begins to work backwards. So that promise of death for those who have become traitors, the deeper magic is if someone takes their place, that prophecy or that prediction cracks, that stone table cracks, and death begins to work backwards. And of course, that happens in Narnia. It's similar to the way Tolkien describes everything sad becoming untrue. And so it really is an eschatological view of the gospel. The reality of the gospel takes everything sad, namely death, right? Because what do we read in the book of Revelation? There will be no more crying or tears. Why? Because death will be no more. And Tolkien, weaves that into his Middle Earth. Lewis does the same thing here when he tells the children death itself begins to work backwards. Well, I want to take just a minute here, and this is going to be a short video. Some of you who listen to longer, larger lectures by Michael Ward, there's a ton of material out there that you can access very lengthy lectures, whole series, or you can read the book Planet Narnia. Now, Planet Narnia is rather expensive, and there's a kind of an abridged version of Planet Narnia called the Narnia Code. Do we have that over there, Ken? So the Narnia Code is an actually affordable version of Planet Narnia. In fact, the low price of $11.97. And this will get you the gist of Planet Narnia. Planet Narnia is the published form of Michael Ward's dissertation that he did on C.S. Lewis. This will get you what you need unless you are just a completist and you have to have. Do we have Planet Narnia over here? You have to take out a loan to get Planet Narnia. So, but Ken will get it for you. You'll get it for him, won't you?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, he'd be more than happy to get Planet Narnia for you. But the Narnia Code will get you all you need to know, and I would encourage you to do that. But again, the warning: you know, some things you can't unsee. Once you see the fully orbed thesis explained and laid out, and he explains it book by book, and we'll go through this next week. So, spoiler alert: if you don't want to know the Easter eggs that are embedded, if you don't want to know the true blueprint and code of Narnia, then just don't come next week. But I hope you do come, because I think if you know, it actually makes the rereading of Narnia, or maybe the reading for the first time, even more insightful. And you see Lewis's brilliance. And again, it's something it took to his grave, and it's something even Tolkien himself couldn't detect, and which probably what led him thinking it was, as I said, kind of higgledy-piggledy. So this is an interview. This is a portion of an interview between Larry Yarn, who's the president of Hillsdale College, and Michael Ward. So I'm just going to let it play. It's about 6 or 7 minutes long, and then we'll talk a little bit about it, and then we'll talk about The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Mixed reception from some people that Lewis respected deeply, friends, about the Narnia books.
Mm-hmm.
What's that about?
Yeah, he read the first few chapters of the first book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, to his friend Tolkien. And Tolkien didn't much like what he was hearing. Tolkien thought the books had been thrown together a bit haphazardly. If you know Tolkien's Middle-earth, that's a very different kind of imagined space. It's very rigorous and thoroughgoing, and it has what he called the inner consistency of reality. Narnia, by contrast, looks a little bit slapdash. Things drawn together from all sorts of different mythological literary traditions. Got the classics and fairy tale and E. Nesbit sort of Edwardian stories, and Father Christmas is in there, and Tolkien didn't like it. And because Tolkien has become famous, his attitude to Narnia has become famous, and lots of people have sort of followed in Tolkien's wake and thought that Tolkien knew the series much better than he actually did. And so they've sort of jumped on the bandwagon and thought, oh yeah, Narnia's not very good, is it? It's just thrown together in an afternoon, and it shouldn't be taken very seriously. But I think that's entirely wrong.
Yeah. Why?
Well, because Lewis was not a random or a slapdash writer or thinker. You know, he had one of the most disciplined and trained and controlled intellects of the 20th century. He didn't do anything casually or thoughtlessly. So Narnia...
That argument won't quite do, though, because Tolkien knew Lewis as a friend for decades. And so the fact that Lewis was or was not like that does not prove about this book.
True.
I'm leading you to the assertion that you have proved about the book.
Yeah, well, as I say, Tolkien dismissed the books quite quickly. You know, he only read or had read to him the first few chapters of the first book, and he threw up his hands in horror and turned away. And he was a hard man to please, Tolkien. He disliked nearly everything that Lewis wrote, actually. Whereas Lewis, in contrast, loved The Lord of the Rings and badgered Tolkien endlessly to finish it. So it was a love-hate relationship they had. Lewis loved Tolkien's works, and Tolkien hated Lewis's works.
It's an odd basis for a friendship, isn't it?
Well, they were in some ways chalk and cheese, but, opposites attract. Anyway, the Narnia books are not casually thrown together. They are structured, I believe. This is the discovery I made when I was doing my doctoral research on Lewis's imagination. They're structured according to the 7 heavens, the 7 planets of medieval cosmology, which Lewis, as a medieval scholar, knew all about, and which he described as spiritual symbols of permanent value, which were especially worthwhile in his own generation. And it's those 7 heavens from which we get the names of the days of the week. So the Sun, the Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn. These 7 planets with their 7 sets of attributes, qualities, and influences. That's what provided Lewis with his scheme, his blueprint, his imaginative design.
And we're going to explore that at length. But before we do, you make an amazing statement, which apparently is true, in your book. Lewis hid that fact. Why would he do that?
Well, he wrote a lot about the planets in other works. He wrote about them academically in his book, The Discarded Image, tracing them historically through literature and art. He wrote about them very explicitly in his trilogy of planetary adventures, sometimes called the Space Trilogy, but that's a mistake. It's better to call it the Ransom Trilogy. And, there, the 7 heavens are used very obviously. He wrote about them too in his poetry. But he thought that the best way to understand the planets, their qualities, their attributes, their personalities, was not through laboriously listing all their particular qualities, but by seizing them in an intuition. Like you might smell a rose or taste a wine and immediately recognize it. That's the best way of knowing these planetary personalities. And so in Narnia, he doesn't tell us what he's up to. And if he had disclosed the secret, it would have frustrated the very thing he was trying to achieve. So that's why it was underhand, as it were, under the table.
But it would have been a perfect answer to Tolkien, right?
Yeah. But then I think Lewis didn't really much care about what Tolkien thought. Because, that there you go again, Tollers, would be the sort of response, I think. And in any case, an artist who has to explain his art in order for it to, be judged worthy, has failed. So I don't think Lewis would have felt under any, he wouldn't have felt it incumbent upon him to explain himself. If it's not Tolkien's pigeon, it's not Tolkien's pigeon.
So let me hear from you, and we'll pick up next week more with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And I'll make
in Narnia, he doesn't tell us what he's up to. And if he had disclosed,
I'll make some brief comments about the rest of the series. We'll read maybe a couple of passages from, say, The Silver Chair and The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and then maybe we'll read something from The Last Battle, which I love as well. But just to get us started tonight and to set us up for next week, might there be 2 or 3 of you who would say, this is my favorite passage in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? Or maybe you just want to say, this is my overall experience of reading or rereading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
I'll kick us off. I mentioned this a week or 2 ago, but for anybody who wasn't here, it struck me this time that when Lucy first steps into the wardrobe and when Edmund first steps into the wardrobe, they expect to find the back, but they go further in. And that jumped out at me because, of course, at the end of the last battle, once they reach Aslan's country, everyone is encouraging them, further up, further in, further up, further in. There's no end to Aslan's country. Let's go in more and more and more. And I say, well, that's right where they started. They began with a hint of eternity that was to come. That is fascinating. It's fascinating. And again, these are children's books, and yet those themes or those phrases or images, they show up in the most unexpected places. Lewis wasn't slapping something together. And that's a great example of that. Another example of that would be in, say, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, when they're going to go over the end of the world, and Ricky Cheap says,
well, what if it just keeps on going? They say, if you go over into the world, and one of the sailors says, well, if you go over the edge of the waterfall, are you going to hit the bottom? He says, what if it just keeps on going? I mean, what if in Aslan country, it just keeps on going? That's what I want, So these things show up. Something else, some other observation, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or a favorite passage that you want to read. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to know if anybody's ever done the math on the psychological age of Lucy by the end of the tales.
Ah, interesting.
Wise.
I will say a little more next week when we talk about Prince Caspian and Voyage, the Dawn Treader, about the timing. As you know, time in Narnia has no relation to time in our world. And a year in our world, well, say with Prince Caspian, with Silverchair, a year in our world has equaled 70 years in Narnia. In other places, the children go back, say they go back in so in Prince Caspian they go back, and it's just been they've been gone for a year, but they've gone back 100 years in Narnia. So the time doesn't stay the same, and I think you can say, which world are we talking about? Well, obviously we're talking about our world. How old is Lucy really? Because they don't actually age in Narnia, do they? If they leave as a child in this world, however long they spend in Narnia, when they come back to our world, they're the same. And yet, in Prince Caspian, they are the ancient, in Prince Caspian, they are the ancient kings and queens. And they predate Prince Caspian by 100 years. Fascinating. And again, Lewis is not overly concerned with time. It's more the effect he's wanting to get across, that time doesn't correlate between our world and Narnia. Because one of the things he's trying to get across is that Narnia is leading to Aslan's country, where ultimately time is not going to be a problem for us. We're not going to be bound by time and worried about time, not just in the sense of, well, David, you only got a minute, are you going to wrap this up? But life does not end. Other thought or passage that you've loved out of Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? Yeah.
Mine is when Aslan plays with Lucy and Susan after the resurrection. Even though there's a battle waging, even though people are dying, there's statues to recover, there's victory to go and achieve, he still has the time to play and encourage and revive.
Isn't that an incredible thing? Yeah, and she captures that, Pauline Baines captures that beautifully. One of the things I love most, and I'll close with this, just as a side note, please, if you've not read Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe, reread it. And maybe let me give you a little homework. For next week, would 5 or 6 of you come back with your favorite passage in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and read it for us and tell us why it's your favorite. And I'll do the same with a couple of the other books, my favorite passages and why they're my favorite. But one of the things I love most about Lucy is her reaction to Aslan. Her reaction to Aslan is so intimate and dear. And you'll see in Prince Caspian, especially, when she discovers Aslan again, she's the only one who hears him calling. Spoiler alert. She's the only one who hears him calling. And the other kids are just saying, you're imagining things, grow up. And yet she hears him calling, but she caves into peer pressure and doesn't go where he's leading. And yet he still pursues her. And when she finally sees him, he talks about his breath on her and how he touches her nose with the tip of his tongue. And that idea of Aslan's breath comes up in the Silverchair as well. And it's actually, it speaks of salvation. It's how he carries us into heaven is by his breath. He saves us by his breath. But I love the way that Lucy responds to Aslan. She responds to him in the tenderest of ways of all the children. And maybe we'll drop some of that out next week. Thanks for coming tonight and being here and brave. Hopefully next week it'll be a little warmer. Next week, what we're going to do is I'm going to walk you through each of the Chronicles very, very briefly. I'll try not to too many spoilers, but I'll try to hit every one of the Chronicles about 5 minutes each and show you how it connects to the seven heavens. Which one of the planets in the medieval cosmos is which chronicle connected to? And your homework for next week will be, can you figure out which of the seven planets The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is telling you about? And why do you think that? Why do you think it's telling you about which planet you think it is? And I'll give you a hint. It has something to do with the theme of last semester that is in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. What was it? The pursuit of joy. So there's your hint. And you can do a little homework, or you can just cheat and go online and say, which planet does Michael Ward say Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe represents? So maybe pray for us. Father, thank you for these dear ones who come out on a cold Thursday night, Lord, to spend a little time learning about Lewis's passion ultimately for Christ. I pray this semester that we will see Christ, whether it's in the story of Aslan, that we'll see Christ as the center of a worldview that overthrows the modernism, postmodernism, and metamodernism of the Space to the Ransom series, whether it's an argument for the reasonableness of Christianity in mere Christianity, or Lord, the reality of sin and temptation and how to fight the good fight of spiritual warfare and Screwtape. Lord, I pray that you protect us as we go. Bring us back together next Thursday night, and I pray that you would begin to create within us Briefy Cheeks hunger for Aslan's country. Lord, give us this, for we ask it in the precious name of Jesus. Amen.